Family law is about people, not paperwork. Trusted by thousands of UK firms, Leap's legal software gives family lawyers a single, fully integrated platform to scale your practice, stay compliant, and deliver better client outcomes. Learn more at leap.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. I am delighted today to welcome onto the podcast Jennifer Coupland, the CEO of CILEX. You've been in post now for, 18 months, Jennifer?
It's actually only been 10 months.
It's only been 10 months. That's just how much water has gone under the bridge in that time.
I haven't reached my anniversary quite yet, but I've certainly packed a lot in, or at least it feels like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, really appreciate you finding a window to join the podcast. Obviously, lots of opportunity today to talk about what's happened over the past 10 months. You have absolutely packed it in, as you say, but also you're currently consulting on your forward plan as well, and an opportunity for you to kind of explore and explain a little bit about that as well, in the context of the fact that the SRA, who had planned, in the context of plans that might have seen CILEX merged into the SRA, or at least CILEX regulation merged into the SRA, not come to fruition as well, of course. So interesting and exciting times ahead. In the first instance, and hopefully that frames the discussion, but in the first instance, tell us a little bit about yourself. You don't, for example, have a legal background, do you? So you come to this with very fresh eyes.
I have indeed, David. So my journey into CILEX has been sort of via the sort of education and training sector. So my background has been most recently in apprenticeships. So I was the CEO of the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education for 6 years. And then I spent some time working at London South Bank University, where I was Pro-Vice Chancellor Skills. So I've come into this legal world with an education and policy sort of background, working with ministers and government and that kind of thing. And it has really been, completely fascinating adjustment, thinking about what I thought it would be like and how it actually is, and where those differences are and where the similarities are with what I previously thought.
Well, I can't let you say that without going into some of the specifics. What have you kind of found that you perhaps weren't expecting?
Well, that's a tricky place to start. So I think I'll start with the things I was expecting. I was expecting it to be quite serious. I was expecting it to be a really important sector, both for, justice and for the economy. So all those things, are absolutely true. I had thought that it would all move a bit more slowly than it does. So it has surprised me that actually when things need to happen in the legal sector, they really can. I think one of the things more culturally, though, that sort of surprised me is the sort of kind of nature of the debates, I think, in the legal world. I thought coming into this from my previous background, I was expecting a very sort of dignified and respectful sort of tenor to the debate, where people would have, quite respectfully delivered arguments and people would agree to disagree and all that kind of stuff. Actually, it's much more brutal than that in certain places, and it can be quite a tough environment, I think, as well. So that's been a bit of an eye-opener for me. That's certainly not what I was expecting.
I look at our community of readers, and listeners will be aware we have today's conveyancer, today's wills and probate, today's family lawyer. They all have quite unique characteristics as well. And I have a lot of sympathy for organizations like yourself, who are really trying to coordinate and cajole and encourage these very disparate kind of communities to come together and to support access to justice. It is an absolutely fascinating profession, isn't it? I was going to say industry, but it's a profession, really, isn't it?
Absolutely agree with you. Yeah.
It has been a whirlwind 10 months that we alluded to at the start. And of course, the context behind that is that, I mean, pretty much as you were appointed, the Mazur kind of decision was made initially. And of course, there was sort of all the appeal and fallout thereafter. We'll come on to that. But I guess now you've been in post for a period of time. What are your thoughts on the place and role that CILEX plays in the legal community?
Well, I think probably I should first acknowledge that it has been a really, really tough 10 months for some of our members. The CILEX community has definitely been in the spotlight through this, and many of them have really been put through the ringer since the Mazur judgment, which did indeed happen 16 days into my tenure as CEO.
16 days.
Day 16,
wow.
Yes, I'll never forget it. So I think the community, I think some are still feeling quite bruised by all of that. But the really positive thing, obviously, is that we did take the case to the Court of Appeal, and we did demonstrate that our interpretation of the law was on the conduct of litigation was correct. So it was great to get that support. So people have been feeling very buoyed, I think, by that. I was reflecting the other evening on, what the narrative would have been like had we not been successful in the Court of Appeal, and that would have just felt very, very different right now. So we've certainly found a place now where we are suddenly much better known as a result of all of this, which is obviously something as CEO of CILEX that I will want to capitalise on. But historically, we've been around for 75 years. We're a chartered body. We're a really important and serious part of the legal system in this country. I think we're the third branch of the law. We are on a par with solicitors and barristers, and then we have our CILEX professionals as well. And we need all of those pieces to be functioning really well and to be respected for what they do, and to be able to play the biggest part possible they can in achieving those big kind of objectives that we all have for the legal system around access to justice and doing things in the consumer's interest and so forth.
One of the things you really major on is the diversity of your community as well. Is that a really important part of your mission?
Well, it's one of the reasons why I wanted the job. So, I mentioned that I previously worked on apprenticeships. I think over the period that I was working on apprenticeships, I like to think that we did turn what was something that was not hugely popular route into something that is now really, really sought after, and people really want to do apprenticeships, and people are saying, well, I won't go to university, I'm going to go and do an apprenticeship instead. And we've really kind of grown the prestige of that. And I think CILEX has got a load of those kinds of ingredients. It's what CILEX is about, the CILEX route, enabling people to kind of train while they're working, so you're earning and learning at the same time, is so important for the diversity of the legal system, because it taps into a pipeline of people who may not otherwise have been able to access these great legal careers. And I think we're all agreed that we want a legal system that better represents the people that it serves. And so we've got to find a way of growing these great routes so that more people can take them, and we can build that diversity and that inclusivity in the legal sector.
Do you see then that CILEX has got a role in upskilling the legal services sector?
Well, I mean, we run our own law school. So CILEX has its own law school run by the fantastic Judith Bourne, and we work really closely with thousands of employers up and down the country, offering apprenticeships, qualifications, and bespoke training packages as well to sort of fit the needs of businesses today, and trying to make sure that what we're doing means that we're offering really, really, really relevant training products that employers actually really want.
Let's move on to talk about Mazur. 16 days in the job, crikey. I didn't realise it was quite so soon after you were appointed. Let's look ahead to start with, I suppose, if we're going to do this backwards. Do you see that there's any further fallout coming from the Mazur ruling?
I absolutely do think that there's further fallout from the Mazur ruling. I think that the whole case really sort of shone a light on this particular issue around the conduct of litigation. But what it's also done is there's a whole sort of set of consequential things that are now, it's now been made more obvious, that kind of existed previously, sitting around in different bits of rules or legislation that actually are quite anachronistic. They're quite illogical, particularly given where the modern legal system is now and how we think the legal system should be operating in the future. So I think there's a lot of stuff in there that we should be looking at. So, for example, today I met with a group of CILEX members who were talking about the need to modernise the language in the civil procedure rules. And, this is something that we'll be, campaigning for, amongst other things, I think, over the next 5 years of our strategy, to try to bring all of this stuff up to date and to get it into a position where it actually works for the public and people can really understand what people are able to do and so forth. So I think it would be a real shame if the sort of Mazur judgment happens, the Court of Appeal judgment happens, and then that's it. Then we don't kind of think about what does that mean. I think it also showed up the need for a review of the Legal Services Act 2007. If you think about that, it became law in 2007. That's the same year the iPhone came out, and the iPhone's had 51 updates since then. So, we haven't looked at this thing, and it is the underpinning of the whole of our legal services system. So it's ripe for review. And I think when, looking back in the history here of how we got to the Legal Services Act itself, I mean, that took about 5 years. It was about 5 years in the making, with the Clementi review and then, consultations and white papers and what have you, before the thing makes its way through Parliament. So I think we should be starting a conversation about this now across the legal sector, even though we don't have parliamentary time this session to do something in this space, because there are bigger priorities. But we could do the work now, and we could have an oven-ready bill for the next government, whatever stripe they are, post the next election. I think we really do need to do it. I don't think we can go into the next election without having re-looked at some of this stuff.
I mean, there is a lot of criticism that the LSA was only really ever a halfway house. It was a mishmash of compromises and all sorts to start with. The fact that it governs, as you say, our entire legal system, feels as though, what you say, it definitely needs looking at.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I think flowing from the Mazur ruling, and I sort of touched on it earlier, is that it has meant that CILEX is much better known, and there's a much broader understanding of what CILEX professionals are doing in firms. So I think that's got to be a positive, because if you think about growing competition in the legal market, it's one of the regulatory objectives, isn't it? Increasing competition. We need consumers to understand that they've got choices with who they seek their legal services from, and I think that the levels of knowledge out in sort of the public domain about how all of this works is really, really pretty low. So trying to help people to understand that there are choices here, and there are specialist CILEX conveyancers and specialists in probate, and so forth, is all to the good, really.
Yeah, I'm never completely sure, and the Legal Services Consumer Panel often looks at this as well. How much consumers actually care about that? I mean, it's certainly an issue that arises in will writing, for example, where of course you've got the regulated solicitor CILEX community and a large unregulated will writing community. But I find very little empirical evidence that the consumers really, to your point, one, understand the difference, but two, whether there's a lot of evidence that they are that bothered by it. I mean, at the end of the day, they need something doing, and does it matter who does it?
Yeah, so I think the Consumers Panel was giving evidence to the Justice Select Committee a few weeks ago, and I think one of the things that he was saying was that actually consumers would quite often be much better off, going to a specialist lawyer for their legal services, but they probably don't necessarily know that. So there's a big education job to do there. But coming into the legal sector, I have been myself a consumer of legal services. And what you want is good quality, don't you? You want to be sure that you've gone to somebody who is properly regulated, who knows what they're doing, and that they can handle your issues appropriately, and that you get a resolution at an affordable price. So I think the quality of legal services does really matter to the public, and we need to be able to explain that better collectively to people, and to help people to make the best choices for themselves.
It's fascinating to hear you say that you think that the speed of change has been quite quick. I dare I refer you to Property Act 1925, the Wills Act 1837 as primary legislation.
I know, David. I mean, yes, yeah. Well, let me just put one caveat to that. When I was saying that what surprised me in terms of the ability of the legal system to move at pace was how quickly we managed to get our appeal through, because that was a matter of public interest. And because we were able to demonstrate that there were real world challenges happening in courts, in local authorities, in law centres networks, we were able to demonstrate that the courts did really move very quickly. They expedited that appeal. So they can, that can happen. But then, of course, as you say, we have things that have been sitting on the statute books since, time immemorial, which,
I'd love to see things like cohabitation looked at, but the challenge, and I sort of alluded to it at the start, the challenge is that each of these areas of law have got so many things that need to change. I mean, we're awaiting a government output on home buying and selling consultation. We are awaiting a cohabitation consultation that was due in the spring. It's the start of June. I don't know when your spring finishes.
That's still a civil service spring, David.
And I also want to sort of applaud CILEX and CILEX regulation for the speed at which you've managed to get your members trained and certified, if that's the best word for it, on the litigation element that Mazur obviously raised.
Rights.
Thank you. Because I know, for example, I mean, we published recently an article from you that, over 1,000 people have now gone through that process in a very, very short space of time.
Yes, that's right. I do need to kind of draw a line between CILEX as the professional body that I'm CEO for, and CILEX regulation, where my colleague John Barwick is CEO, because it's CILEX regulation that have run that practice rights process and award practice rights. So we don't do that. We've tried to work closely with CRL to try to enable that process to happen more swiftly and with fewer pain points for people. But we've come out of this with over 1,000 people now having got litigation practice rights, so that they are fully authorised. They can delegate work to unauthorised staff and can supervise those people as well. So it's giving people those credentials for things that they've probably hugely capable of doing, and in many respects have been doing previously in their professional lives. So it's good that we've got here, but it has been pretty bumpy on the way.
Sure. If a judgment that ultimately spelled real disaster for the organisation was not one existential crisis, a second was also on the horizon with the potential merger, as we said, between the SRA and CRL. That was sort of seems to have been put on the back burner. The latest consultation from the SRA sort of says, no, that's not going to happen. I guess, look, is that a can that's been kicked down the road? Is that the end of that conversation for now, forever? What's your sort of take on that situation?
Yeah, so I mean, as you've mentioned, CILEX and the SRA have been in quite advanced discussions about redelegation and de-delegation of CILEX's regulatory responsibilities. But with Sarah Rapson joining the SRA, coming in as the new chief executive, me coming into CILEX as the new chief executive, we're both looking at what do we need. What are the priorities for our organisations? What do we need to do now to get our organisations on a much better footing? Sarah's got huge challenges at the SRA, and I think we both came to the conclusion that to make that change at this particular point in time, given the environment within which we were going to have to do that, was just going to take our organisations away from sort of the key priorities that we have for our individual organisations. But we absolutely remain committed to having our members regulated in an effective way, in a proportionate way, to have a regulator that is responsive to their needs and working in a system where we can design out any kind of unnecessary duplication, and to have a system that is much more value for money. So we are still looking to streamline regulation going forward. That certainly continues to be our ambition. So it's not a case of that we're just closing down the conversation about what does good regulation look like in this space. 70% of CILEX members work in SRA regulated firms. They're subject to lots of regulation. Coming to this world fresh, there's got to be a better way of doing this, right? So I think we do want to kind of continue to explore that.
Yeah, you probably answered my next sort of question then. So you see that there's scope for collaboration between the two organisations?
So you mean between CILEX and the SRA? I think there's a need for much greater collaboration across the whole of the legal services sector. I think one of the things, that the Mazur case showed up is that professional bodies and their relevant regulators have not collaborated effectively hitherto, and we've had different bits of guidance on different topics and people have been completely confused. So I do think that there's a lot more scope for more collaboration. I think the Legal Services Board agree with me on that one as well.
Let's move on to the third part of the discussion. You'll be pleased to hear that we're nearing the end of the time that we have together, but as we said at the start, you're currently consulting on future plans for CILEX. We've obviously just been discussing the fact that there is going to be a future for CILEX. What are your key priorities over the course of the next 12, 18 months, 5 years, 5 years?
Yeah, so I think this is a really exciting time now for CILEX, because we've been doing a lot of work informally with our members, with external stakeholders, our own board and our staff as well, to kind of get everybody's views feeding into what do we need to be doing and what do we want to achieve over the next sort of five-year term. And we've got sort of four big strategic goals that we're sort of talking about. The first is around building that really proud professional community, and we've already got so much in that space. But thinking about from our members' perspective, why do you want to be a CILEX member? Why do you want CILEX to be your professional body? What are you getting out of that? What's the sort of offer for members, and how do we help the wider public kind of understand what CILEX is all about and what that route means? So that's the first part of our thinking is about that professional community. The second kind of big objective is around providing excellent education for a growing profession. So there's two big bits in there. There's the whole kind of piece around what is the training and qualifications offer that we need to have for CILEX professionals going forward, particularly now as things are changing so rapidly with AI. How do we future-proof that? How do we make sure that people are being trained with the skills that employers need their people to have for the future? But the other part is that thing about growing. I'm really ambitious for CILEX. I think we've got a really bright future, and I think thinking about the diversity piece in particular, we could make such a big difference to legal services. But we're currently only 17,500 members. Each of those individuals is an agent for change in the legal services world, but we need more of them. And so working out how we can kind of really grow that profession and really make it into something where it can realise its ambitions, realise its potential. So that's really important to me. And then The sort of third leg of the stool really is about driving change. So it's that sort of policy facing stuff. It's the, what things do we think need reform in the system, and making the case for that. I have as you know, a sort of policy background, so I'm used to kind of working with ministers and government and key opinion formers and so forth. So using that to sort of make a case for change where we think that's important, and elevating our profile, just getting us much better known so people understand who we are. And you're not the only CILEX person in the firm and having to explain what it is every time anyone sees your credentials. So that's really, really important to me.
You mentioned AI in there, and there's a huge amount of kind of stuff that's happening around that. Interesting to hear you say that you really feel as though practitioners need a lot of support and guidance around that. I think one of the things I see from organisations like yourself, from the SRA, from the Law Society, Bar Standards Board, whoever it might be, is there is a real drive to share guidance and share information, and I'm sure it's hugely appreciated by practitioners, but I'm not always completely convinced that there's a coordinated effort around it. That, for example, I know the Bar Standards Board have just put out an AI guidance document. How much of that could be repurposed for CILEX lawyers, for the sake of argument, so that we have a more joined up, coming back to your point about collaboration, that we have a more joined up approach amongst the regulators and the membership bodies towards some of these really critical issues that impact practitioners who, as you say, CILEX lawyers in SRA regulated practices, CLC lawyers in SRA regulated practices, CILEX in the CLC, that sort of dynamic.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think it goes back to my call really for a real kind of cross-sector collaboration about some of the big issues that we need to tackle here. So, between now and the next election, if we're working on, Legal Services Act 2.0, we are going to have something in there, aren't we, about AI and what it means to operate in an AI-driven environment. I think we have got lots of very, some great, really well-intentioned stuff going on at the moment, but it does feel like everyone's doing it in their little silo. They're all having their own little thoughts about it. And actually, I think there's a trick being missed in terms of that coordination across the sector altogether to try to move forward and think about, what does this mean for, big city law firms doing kind of international M&A versus high street firm doing conveyancing. What does it mean, and how do you make sure that you're the right side of the line with ethics, and you're thinking about, the fact that there's always going to be a person behind the AI. The AI is not the lawyer. There has to be a person behind that, in the same way that you need to be clear through with all of the stuff we've been talking about Mazur, about who is responsible, who is on the hook for the advice that's being given here. And it isn't the AI tool, it's the person who's using the AI tool and is instructing it. So we've got to work our way around all of that, and I think doing that as a collective and trying to get a bit more alignment would be a very, very wise thing to do.
I just, on a personal level, I think a more joined up approach to a lot of this stuff would ultimately help your regulated communities. And I often think about the lawyer who comes into work in the morning, sits down at their desk at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, doesn't leave until 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, and they've got a day job to do. They're there doing their legal work, and so much of this stuff happens on the periphery of that. And as I say, I just wish that the lawyer would sometimes be kind of the real focus of some of that attention, rather than kind of the guidance for the sake of guidance, for argument's sake.
Yeah. I think from our perspective as the professional body for CILEX members, we want to enable people to really embrace this new technology and to be confident using it, and to be able to do it, to stay the right side of the law with what they're doing, and use it in a way that enhances their services to their clients, right? Makes their life easier. My colleagues in CRL are the regulator. They will produce guidance on what is appropriate to do and what isn't appropriate to do in this circumstance. So I see that as a complementary piece. But you're absolutely right. For a lawyer, you know, let's say it's a CILEX, you know, property lawyer sitting in an SRA regulated firm, where are they looking, you know, we kind of need to make it centric, don't we, for them, so that it's easy for them to do the right thing in this space, as easy as possible.
We could keep talking for much of the rest of the day, but it's as much as we have time for on the podcast today, Jennifer. I know that you're very keen for the community to engage with the consultation, aren't you?
Absolutely. So we have written a very, I think, engaging consultation document that sort of sets out those big strategic goals I was talking about, but also some stuff about, you know, well, what does that actually mean and what will you do underneath each of those big strategic goals? So, for example, part of that building that proud professional community, we've got some thoughts in there around what we need to do next with the sort of titles that people use in practice, and aligning those titles better with the regulatory titles, so that everybody can be much clearer about what people are doing. So there's some meaty things in there that we really want to get people's views on. The consultation closes on the 17th of June, so it's only a couple more weeks left to go. So please head to the CILEX website, look it up, and take a few minutes just to give us your thoughts, because we really want to hear what people think about it.
Yeah, one of my biggest frustrations is that people complain about something that might or might not happen, but when they're given an opportunity to have their say, they don't, and therefore it makes it very difficult to sort of have a comeback on that, doesn't it? It's been fantastic to have you on the podcast, Jennifer. I really, really appreciate you joining and being part of the discussion today.
Thank you. It's been really nice talking to you, David.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Jennifer. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.